The first thing to say is that the craving for both autonomy and connection is not a problem to be solved, it's more of a pattern to be learned. Picture a single body moving across a room. At one moment it steps away, testing the empty space, delighting in the freedom to turn, to tilt the head, to breathe without permission. The next moment it pivots and reaches for another hand, seeking the steady warmth of a palm, the quiet confirmation of being known. That pattern, step, reach, is the human condition writ small. We are creatures of two contradictory hungers. We want to roam, we want to be anchored. We want the sky and the hearth. We want to write our own sentences and to be read. That dual appetite is not a defect in our design, but the foundation of everything we call loneliness, creativity, and conflict. Ask yourself, when was the last time you felt both utterly yourself and utterly seen? Many of us remember moments when solitude felt like a sharpening, the clarity of walking alone at dawn, thinking without echo, and moments when belonging felt like a balm. A kitchen where names are known and laughter is shared like bread. But the moments when those two states sit together, balanced like a compass needle, are rare. Why? Because freedom and belonging pull in different directions. Freedom wants indeterminacy, openness, the ability to change course without apology. Belonging asks for constancy, predictability, the quiet economy of mutual expectations. Freedom tolerates the risk of isolation. Belonging tolerates the friction of constraint. Part of the tension is structural. Humans evolved in groups. Survival depended on being recognized by others, on the ability to read faces, to exchange trust. The safety of the group allowed for risk-taking in other domains. Yet the same groups created norms, obligations, and reputations. Somewhere in the wiring of our brains are circuits that light up when we experience recognition and circuits that flare when our autonomy is threatened. Developmental psychology points to attachment and individuation as simultaneous processes. As infants, we cling because we must. As children, we pull away because we must. The swing of dependency and separation is education and emergency both. It shapes the narrative we carry into adulthood. The trust we feel when someone stays, the suspicion when someone asks for proof of allegiance. Philosophers have lived inside this tension too. There is a freedom that commands. You are the author of your life, responsible for every choice, a solitary sovereignty. That is the sharp freedom that terrifies as much as it exhilarates, the existentialist conviction that with freedom comes unbearable responsibility. Opposite that, there is a freedom that appears when we commit ourselves to others, the paradoxical idea that by binding ourselves, we open a different, deeper liberty. Commitments limit options but enlarge meaning. Jean-Paul Sartre warned us about the vertigo of absolute freedom. Martin Buber taught that the self becomes itself in relation, in the face-to-face where I meets thou. Hegel, in his dense but luminous way, argued that recognition by another is not a mere nicety but the condition of self-consciousness itself. To be free, it turns out, we first require recognition. To belong, we have to retain enough selfhood not to vanish into the collective. What does this look like in ordinary life? It looks like the artist who locks the door to work, who needs silence to summon an image, who then feels empty until they hear someone speak their name at the opening night and knows the work was received. It looks like the immigrant who crosses an ocean to secure a life that promises choice, and in doing so, leaves behind the language and the neighborhoods that once cupped them. It looks like a couple in a kitchen negotiating the simplest of things: money, bedtime, the roles of expectation, and discovering that what feels like betrayal to one is survival for the other. In every case, loneliness is not merely the absence of people, but the misalignment between the self we enact and the spaces that receive us. Loneliness and creativity are bound up in that misalignment. Solitude can be the womb of new thought. When the mind is unshared, it invents its answer. Many creative acts require a private chamber, a refusal for a season to be governed by the taste of the crowd. Yet when solitude calcifies into isolation, creativity loses its conversation. A poem without readers is a practice. A practice without dialogue risks self-deceit. The creative person continually negotiates between two needs: to be wild enough to surprise oneself, and to be visible enough to be provoked by others' mirror. Conflict is the public face of this tension. When two people, two groups, or two nations insist on freedom without recognition or on belonging without autonomy, friction ensues. In relationships, the demand for absolute independence often reads as abandonment. The demand for absolute loyalty reads as control. On the political plane, ideologies that prize liberty above all forget that liberty without social recognition slides into inequality. Ideologies that prize community without dissent calcify into coercion. The social imagination that keeps us humane must be able to hold both, the necessity of dissent and the necessity of care. So what do we do with this? How do we live in the middle of two necessary forces without being crushed or co-opted by either? The first corrective is simple to state, though not always easy to practice. We must learn to hold the tension. This is not a palliative trick. It is a sustained discipline of recognition and boundary. It means practicing a twofold stance, affirming one's right to self-direction while affirming, in equal measure, the right of others to belong and to be recognized. In practice, this looks like refusing the myth that autonomy is the same as isolation, and refusing the myth that belonging requires the loss of self. Psychology offers routes for that practice. Attachment theory teaches that secure attachment does not mean dependence. It means the assurance that one can explore and return. The secure person does not fear solitude because they expect a safe haven. Self-determination theory names autonomy, competence, and relatedness as three essential psychological nutrients. Notice how these are not a hierarchy but a tripod. Remove one leg and the structure wobbles. In therapy and in lived life, the work often becomes how to cultivate autonomy that is supported, competence that is witnessed, relatedness that allows room to grow. There are practical, philosophical practices that flow from this insight. Commitments can be reconceived as chosen constraints, voluntary structures that shape freedom rather than shackle it. When you choose a partner, a career, a community, you limit certain possibilities, but you also clarify and deepen others. Practice can reconceive solitude as a laboratory rather than a prison, and gatherings as experiments in mutual recognition rather than arenas for domination. Language matters here. Speak of interdependence rather than dependency, of responsible freedom rather than raw license, of covenant rather than contract. A covenant is an ethical pact, made not to constrain but to cultivate. We can name habits that help, cultivate small rituals that signal returnability, the evening call, the shared meal, the weekly check-in, and cultivate interior rituals that allow for solitary exploration. A morning walk without a phone, a writing practice that permits error. Learn the art of negotiated autonomy. Practice saying, I need this space for my work. I also value our time together. Can we structure it so both live? Learn the art of radical listening. When recognition is the medicine someone asks for, give it without turning it into your project. Observe where your shame around dependency or your anxiety about autonomy distorts your choices. Often the most liberating act is to tell the truth about the fear that drives you. Philosophically, there is work in reshaping stories. We inherit narratives that set freedom and belonging as opposites. The lone genius, the communal drone. Replace these with a story of the apprentice and the mentor, the artist in community, the citizen who chooses both dissent and duty. Read history as a record not merely of individuals or masses, but of the continual invention of forms that allow people to belong without erasing difference. Consider that the greatest moral achievements, movements for justice, creative renaissances, often arise when people find ways to weave autonomy into shared commitments. And finally, hold a question like a lantern. What would it mean to create institutions, families, and friendships that honor both the need to be oneself and the need to be known? Imagine schools where curiosity and consent are taught together, where students are given real choices within a caring framework. Imagine neighborhoods organized around shared projects rather than surveillance. Imagine partnerships that are negotiated rituals, returning again and again to the question, how do we love one another without swallowing one another? I could stop here and leave you with the ache of the question. Instead, let me offer this small, quiet experiment you might try between reading these pages and the next. For 1 week, notice every time you choose solitude and every time you choose company. Note not only the external choice, but the feeling beneath it. Is it hunger, fear, longing, habit? Do not judge, simply map. Then, at the end of the week, ask yourself, Where could I add a tiny ritual that would make my solitude restorative and my belonging restorative? Where am I leaning toward the hard edges of freedom or the soft bind of belonging in ways that cost me my integrity? There is more to say. Deeper histories, more psychological detail, stories and fractures, and the ways communities have invented strange remedies. But the beginning is always this: to see the dance, to name it, to feel its ache and its possibility. We do not escape the tension between freedom and belonging. We learn to choreograph it. There is a moment I keep returning to in my mind. A small theater, the lights dimmed, a single musician tuning at center stage. The sound at first is private, fingers finding strings, a breath testing resonance. And then, when the bow meets the string, the sound becomes public. The notes do not lose anything in that transfer. They change shape. They are both the musician's solitude made audible and the audience's shared having of that solitude. That image is a useful way into what I want to say next. Loneliness and belonging are not binary endpoints but transformations of the same material. The private becomes public. The public returns to the private changed. The problem comes when the transformation is broken, when our private notes are never heard, or when our public life eats the private music whole. Loneliness is often imagined as an affliction to be cured, a medical diagnosis to be treated. But there is another way to think about it, as information, an embodied signal about the mismatch between inner life and external recognition. The body has pain so that we notice damage. Loneliness is a psychosocial pain reminding us that some essential attunement is missing. If you have ever stood in a crowded room and felt invisible, you know the sting. If you have ever had all the messages and none of them landing like a hand on the shoulder, you know the peculiar despair of being unrecognized. That sting can be clarifying. It teaches us where our commitments are thin, where our communities are performative rather than reciprocal, where our freedom has become exile. Recognition is the invisible currency in much of human life. To be recognized is to have your interiority echoed back, your efforts, your values, your pain acknowledged as real. And recognition is not merely praise. It is witness. Hegel's strange book on recognition, Sartre's private torment, Buber's luminous I thou. They converge on a simple claim. Selves become persons in relation. This is not merely poetic. Neuroscience and developmental observation show that when infants are mirrored, when caregivers return their expression, the infant learns an anatomy of self that expects others to hold them. As we grow, our early experiences set patterns. Some of us learn to expect recognition and to risk exposure. Others learn to hide the true self in anticipation of neglect or punishment. The social world then becomes a stage where these early scripts are replayed, sometimes tragically. Creativity sits squarely in the middle of these scripts. The artist who isolates to invent is not escaping community. They are engaging in a disciplined estrangement necessary for novelty. But creativity also needs return. A painting that hangs unseen is an echo chamber. A theory that never meets critique is a perilous monoculture. There is a deep economy at work. Solitude produces difference. Community produces calibration. The twin demands are not resolved by toggling between extremes, but by weaving practices that allow both to flourish together. Think of the workshop that demands silence and solo time for craft, then gathers for critique that is governed by rules. Give permission before commenting, distinguish description from judgment, ask the author what kind of feedback they want. Those structural scaffolds, clear norms, consent, staged vulnerability, are the technologies of a thriving creative belonging. Conflict is the smoke that tells us where the oxygen of this dance is lacking. When people clash, it is less often over the abstract good of freedom or the abstract good of community and more often over the concrete terms of living together. Whose autonomy gets prioritized, whose needs get named, whose belonging is taken for granted. Consider families. The teenager who pushes for independence is read as ingratitude. The parent who insists on rules is read as suffocating. Consider institutions. The employee who seeks flexible hours is read as shirking. The manager who demands predictability is read as authoritarian. In each case, what fuels disputes is a failure of imagination. We have not yet designed a practice that honors both needs. Conflict, properly handled, can be the fulcrum of institutional creativity. Handled badly, it becomes the fuel of estrangement. So what practical, psychological, and philosophical tools are available for people who want to live inside the tension without losing themselves? First, change the metaphor. Instead of thinking of freedom and belonging as two weights on a seesaw, think of them as two notes in a chord. A chord is not one note subordinated to the other. It is an arrangement where dissonance can be productive. Learn to hear dissonance as information rather than only as threat. When a relationship scrapes, ask, what note is out of tune? Who needs to be heard that isn't? This is a humble, curiosity-driven move, not an accusation. Second, cultivate rituals of return and rituals of solitude. Rituals create predictable spaces where different parts of our life can be practiced safely. A nightly ritual, a shared meal, a brief report of one joy and one struggle, signals to the group that people belong even as they pursue private projects. A solitude ritual, a fixed time blocked for thinking without interruption, signals to the self that exploration is allowed. If civilizations invented liturgies to hold violent epics together, small-scale rituals can hold household and workplace life together. The shape of these rituals matters. They should be short, predictable, and named. Naming is powerful. To say, "This is our Tuesday listening hour," turns practice into promise. Third, develop the muscle of negotiated boundary. Boundaries are not weapons but instruments of mutual respect. A boundary says, "I will not be harmed in this way," and also, when negotiated, "I want you to understand why." Practice framing boundaries as invitations to joint problem solving. "I need 2 hours alone after work to do my writing. I also want to spend time with you. Can we plan dinner for 8 o'clock and give me 6 to 8 for writing?" Small, specific agreements beat vague resolutions every time. They also create data. We learn what works by trying and revising. Fourth, reframe solitude as a civic practice, not only a private indulgence. Solitude should not be a retreat from responsibility. It should be a replenishment for engagement. Public institutions can support this by valuing quiet and focused work. Think libraries, studios with residency months, contemplative commons in schools. Individuals can support each other by recognizing that to ask for solitude is not rejection but a labor of care for the future of the relationship. Respond to requests for space with curiosity rather than offense. What would help you use that time well? This small shift dissolves the primal interpretation that space equals abandonment. Fifth, educate for recognition. Recognition is a skill. It can be taught and practiced. Begin conversations with reflective listening. Repeat back what you heard before you respond. Ask open-ended questions that invite another to elaborate. What mattered most to you about that? Practice naming the invisible. I see you've taken on the planning work. That must feel heavy. These moves are not sentimental. They recalibrate neural pathways. They turn strangers into neighbors and neighbors into kin. There are larger philosophical moves too. Think of autonomy as relational, the idea that freedom is exercised within a web of relationships that give it meaning. This is not a diminishment of individual rights, but a richer account of what rights mean in flesh and blood life. Think of belonging as plural, not a demand for sameness, but an invitation to shared projects and contested, tolerant norms. Political theorists have called for institutions that give voice without dissolving difference. At the level of everyday life, this means creating spaces where dissent is practiced as civic service, not as criminal defiance. Ask yourself some curious experiments. What if you treated loneliness as a prompt instead of a verdict? What if you invited 3 people to a shared project with clear roles and a time limit? The constraints might generate surprising freedom within shape. What if you began meetings with 2 minutes of silent reflection so people could arrive into their own minds before going into shared talk? Small policy changes in small groups often produce outsized moral effects. Finally, remember that the dance is not performed perfectly. It is practiced. There will be missteps, apologies that feel insufficient, boundaries that sting, rituals that falter. That is inevitable. What matters is the attitude toward repair. If we can develop cultures of prompt repair, the willingness to notice harm, to accept responsibility, to make amends, and to negotiate new agreements, then freedom and belonging will not be a battleground but a workshop. Repair is the grammar of sustainable relations. It teaches us that autonomy without accountability breeds loneliness, and belonging without accountability breeds coercion. The craft, then, is to educate ourselves in both accountability and generosity. As you sit with these words, test one small practice. Tonight, before you sleep, trace the outline of a recent tension in your life and ask yourself, was the struggle about unrecognized needs or about threatened autonomy? Try to name one specific ritual or boundary that might have altered the outcome. You do not have to act on it now. Curiosity is itself a form of beginning. There is a long way yet to go in this exploration. Historical case studies of communities that recalibrated themselves, intimate stories of radical repair, the neuroscience of recognition, the role of the market in shaping belonging, and the peculiar modern challenge of digital-sourced belonging. We will get to these. For now, hold this thought. The work of living between freedom and belonging is not a solo performance, and it is not a communal absorption. It is a practice duet, sometimes improvisational, sometimes scored, always requiring the patience to listen to both the self and the world. There is a narrow window of evening light through my kitchen, the kind that makes the ordinary world look as if someone has patiently dusted it with meaning. In that light, I watch a neighbor across the way hang a single shirt on a line, and I realize how small acts strand themselves between freedom and belonging. The shirt is an assertion of domestic autonomy. The act of hanging it where other neighbors will see it is a claim to visibility. We live our lives in those narrow gestures, and the drama of living between autonomy and attachment is often not in the great declarations but in the ordinary choreography. Who cooks, who calls, who shows up for the recital, who takes the last biscuit without asking. At the heart of identity is a paradox that philosophy and psychology keep returning to. The self is both a story we tell and a story we are told. From childhood, we gather plot lines from those around us. The family myth that you were the responsible one, the classroom recurring role of the quiet kid, the community memory that colors your name. These narratives are not neutral facts. They are interpretive lenses that shape habit, choice, shame, and courage. To claim autonomy is to try to edit that story. To claim belonging is to accept a role in the stories others carry. The difficulty is that editing a story is rarely a solitary act. It requires witnesses who will accede to a new narrative, or at least tolerate it. Shame is the dark cousin of belonging, a social emotion that arises when we perceive ourselves as failing to conform to the norms that secure connection. There is a particular cruelty in shame because it alters perception. You no longer see the world as it is, but as it must be in order for you to be acceptable. Shame tells you to hide, to shrink, to sleepwalk through your gifts so as not to disturb the order. Vulnerability, on the other hand, is the risky posture that invites recognition. It asks, with all the trembling of someone offering their hand first, "Will you see me?" When recognition arrives, shame dissolves into relief. When it does not, shame hardens into a brittle armor that can look, tragically, like independence. Cultures differ in how they hold these tensions. Some customs encourage the individual to single themselves out, to be celebrated for striking difference, while others privilege the smooth functioning of the group. Neither pole is innocent. Cultures that valorize radical autonomy can produce splendid loneliness dressed up as dignity. Cultures that valorize seamless belonging can swallow difference in the name of harmony. The work of a mature society is to neither romanticize solitude nor infantilize the individual. It must create practices that let persons flourish without flattening them. Modern life throws new accelerants into this old fire. Mobility, migration, the churn of careers, and digital platforms all reconfigure how we find and lose belonging. The internet offers infinitely extendable stages where you can perform identity, but it also creates the illusion of friendship without the labor of maintenance. The same device that lets you message a friend across time zones can also become a proxy for intimacy, a scaffold that substitutes quantity for quality. In this environment, rituals that once anchored life, long lunches, neighborhood festivals, apprenticeships, are frayed. The solution is not returning to a mythical past, but inventing new rituals that account for our mobility and our speed. Creativity, again and again, appears as both a symptom and a solution. The creative person converts loneliness into language, isolation into form. But creativity is not merely the artist's province. It is the civic virtue of any person who fashions a life. To craft a life is to create patterns of belonging around the contours of one's autonomy. That craft requires imagination, not only for solitary invention but for crafting conditions in which others can acknowledge and amplify that invention. Think of mentorship not as a charitable gesture but as a technological improvement to the social world. An apprentice learns enough to be free in the future because someone gives them the scaffold to try, fail, and be seen failing. Conflict will always be our grammar when people try to inhabit both poles. Yet there are finer grammars for conflict, forms that do not simply enact domination or capitulation. One such grammar is repair. Repair is a practiced art. Notice harm, name it, accept responsibility, make amends, and renegotiate the terms of engagement. It assumes that people are fallible but capable of change. Repair cultures replace performative belonging with accountable belonging. They teach that to belong is not to be forgiven automatically, but to be given the opportunity to restore trust through visible acts. Practical philosophy in everyday life looks like this. First, tell better stories about commitment. Instead of believing that any commitment is a chain, imagine commitments as gardens whose borders must be tended. A garden needs boundaries, fences, paths, but its joy comes from the variety of growth within. Second, practice graduated fidelity. You do not have to pledge yourself utterly on day one. Rather, you undertake small promises that can be deepened. This counters the existential panic some feel about forever choices and creates a rhythm of testing and renewal. Third, practice attuned availability. Show up in ways that are calibrated to another's need. Sometimes that means silence, sometimes presence, sometimes help with groceries. The simplest sign, "I saw you," is often more sustaining than grand gestures. There are structural moves worth imagining as well. Schools can teach the art of recognition, not as an add-on but as a core skill. Workplaces can design sabbaticals and residency weeks, not as perks but as civic investments in cultivating people who can both think alone and collaborate well. Neighborhoods can reclaim stoops, block parties, and projects that insist on cooperation for a time-limited, concrete goal. Repaint the playground, plant a tree, cook a communal meal. Institutions that embed practices of welcome and returnability convert strangers into neighbors without coercion. Psychological tools support these structural imaginations. Narrative therapy helps individuals see that identity is malleable. Cognitive tools teach us how to reframe automatic shame-driven thoughts. Attachment-informed practices help people negotiate closeness without swamping one another. At the same time, practices from contemplative traditions, simple attention training, short daily reflection, learning to sit with discomfort, build the capacity to tolerate the slow work of belonging. These are not miraculous solutions. They are practices that accumulate efficacy over time. Ask yourself a few charged questions as you read. Which stories about yourself have you inherited that feel like armor or like cage? What would it cost to try one small edit to that story, to say publicly or privately, "I am not the person who always says yes"? Where in your life is your solitude fertile, and where is it merely defensive? How often do you mistake the silence of others for rejection when it might be their own exhaustion? An experiment you might try. Choose one small, bounded commitment, a weekly coffee, a short walk with a neighbor, a 2-hour block each Tuesday for reading, and treat it like an appointment with your future self. Keep it for 4 weeks and notice what changes. Does your sense of belonging deepen? Does the commitment compress your freedom in a painful way, or does it shape it? Record the sensations: shame, relief, irritation, gratitude. These data will teach you more than a single theory. Finally, remember that the aesthetic of a life lived between freedom and belonging is not neat symmetry but asymmetric balance. One season you may need wide, open space. Another season you will crave anchor. The wise life is not one that solves the tension permanently, but one that learns the modest arts of passage. How to move from solitude into crowd without losing your edges. How to enter belonging with reserves of self intact. How to leave honorably when it is time. How to return when needed. These are not once and for all skills, but crafts to be practiced across decades. There is a particular courage in living this way. The courage to be known and the courage to risk being alone. They look similar at a glance, both require telling a truth, yet they are distinct muscles. Cultivate them both. Put them into small rituals and small agreements. Teach them where you can. And when you fail, repair. This is the slow work of human life. Never perfectly resolved, always worth practicing. There is a small, stubborn truth that keeps returning to me like an uninvited guest who will not be shooed away. Belonging and freedom are not static possessions but processes that have to be tended every day. They rust if neglected. They flourish when given attention. Think of them as living things in a household. A plant that needs the right light and water. A dog that needs both the leash for walks and the open field to run. You can't love them from a distance. You have to learn their rhythms, watch for what's wrong, and admit when you've forgotten to feed them. Imagine a person in midlife who has been praised all her life for being the responsible one. She learned early that safety is earned by compliance. She built competence on the scaffolding of other people's expectations. It looked like freedom, a steady job, a tidy home, admirable restraint. But inside, an ache grew. Not a dramatic howl, but a low, persistent throb. She began to feel as if the story she was living had been written by someone else. When she tried to change a line, to leave for an artist's residency, to speak an unpracticed truth, the world reacted as if something had been stolen. Belonging in that context was a gentle incarceration. The paradox is that the same structures that offered her belonging also whispered that to be loved she must not change. Autonomy felt like a betrayal. Submission felt like survival. This is where grief enters the dance. Change, even change that leads to greater integrity, often requires the quiet grieving of what we leave behind. When a person claims more of their agency, the group they belong to may grieve too. It loses its prior shape, its known role sizes. And grief is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of attachment. If your leaving causes grief in others, that is how you know you mattered. The skill is to hold grief as part of the transition, to make space for the sorrow of loss and the excitement of the new. Rituals, small, marked acts that acknowledge endings and beginnings, are the technology we've used across cultures for this very reason. They create permission to move. There is a philosophical kernel here too. Courage and honesty are not identical, but they are cousins. Courage without honesty becomes performative valor. Honesty without courage becomes cruelty. To claim freedom ethically is to practice honest courage, to tell the truth about one's needs while refusing to weaponize that truth to harm others. This requires language, and language is a skill we can learn. It sounds simple to say, "I need time to work," but complicated in the moment because saying it risks disappointment, anger, and withdrawal. The moral craft is to speak in ways that both claim space and invite partnership. I need time to write. It matters to me. I don't want that to mean I'm leaving you. Can we plan for how I'll make time and still be present? Such sentences are small acts of civic virtue. They honor both the self and the other. The architectures we build around our lives matter enormously. A marriage without negotiated rhythms will calcify into resentments. A workplace that never allows for solo work will muffle creativity. A city without third places, the cafes, parks, and marketplaces where strangers become neighbors, will make loneliness an easy default. Architectural design, urban planning, institutional policy. These are not mere conveniences. They are moral technologies. When a city builds parks with benches that face one another, when an office provides quiet pods and generous leave policies, when schools teach listening as a discipline, we are literally shaping the conditions for the dance between freedom and belonging to occur. At the interpersonal level, there are practices that earn their value through repetition. One of the simplest is what I call 2-minute witnessing. It asks nothing dramatic. In any conversation, take 2 minutes to simply reflect back what the other said, without advice, without story matching, without correcting. The first time it feels awkward. The third time it feels like oxygen. This tiny practice repairs one of the most corrosive dynamics we have, the proliferation of solipsistic response. People feel known when someone attends to them without making them into a problem to fix. Recognition as a habit outperforms sentimentality. Repair is the other indispensable habit. If belonging is a practice, repair is its housekeeping. Repair does not mean perpetual forgiveness for ongoing harm. It means a cultural reflex that notices damage, names it, and moves to restore trust. The grammar of repair is specific and not mystical. Describe the harm without launching an indictment. Accept responsibility where responsibility is due. Make amends that are concrete and proportional, and agree on new practices that reduce the chance of recurrence. People who have practiced repair in family life know how transformative it can be. A single honest apology that is paired with a change in behavior can reset a decade of distance. Conversely, avoidance and denial are corrosive. They calcify hurt into a structure that houses bitterness and covert sabotage. Attachment patterns, discovered in developmental psychology, remain a powerful map. Those of us with secure attachments move through life with a basic sense that we can trust and be trusted. Those with anxious attachments interpret neutrality as rejection. Those with avoidant patterns interpret intimacy as engulfment. Recognizing one's pattern is not an excuse. It is a tool. If you know you tend to hide your needs, avoidant, you can set a small experiment. Tell one person a modest need this week and observe the response. If you know you tend to expect rescue, anxious, practice self-calming strategies before you ask for reassurance. Therapy, group work, and reflective practices can change these patterns over time, but change begins with curiosity rather than self-condemnation. There is an economic and political dimension too. Market pressures that prize hustle and hypermobility make both freedom and belonging harder to sustain. When work becomes atomized into gig tasks, relationships at work become transactional. When housing pushes people further apart, neighborhood ties fray. In such a world, intentional communities, co-housing, cooperatives, cultural collectives, are experiments in reweaving belonging without sacrificing individual autonomy. They are not utopias. They are laboratories. They show that with clear shared agreements, rotational responsibilities, and structured exits and re-entries, people can cultivate rich communal life while preserving private freedom. Technology complicates and amplifies everything. The same screen that makes long-distance affection possible can also make proximate care lazy. Social media offers the illusion of belonging, a stream of likes and performative sympathy, while starving the deeper work of recognition. Smart design can help. Platforms that nudge people to follow through on small commitments, apps that encourage micro-rituals of checking in, and norms that privilege long-form exchanges over bite-sized applause would be small but meaningful corrections. But technology cannot replace the slow work of face-to-face repair, the awkwardness of apologies, the warmth of shared silence. We must use tools without letting them become substitutes for the slow crafts humans need. So what to do in practice tonight? Try a short, decisive experiment. Choose one person in your life with whom you have felt a tension. Not the dramatic enemy, but the steady friction. A sibling, a neighbor, a colleague. Write them a letter, email is fine, of 2 or 3 sentences that do 3 things. Name one thing you appreciate about them. Name one change you would like to try that would make it easier for you to belong and be free, and offer a concrete, short-term trial of that change. 2 weeks is a good window. Keep your tone curious and non-demanding. You may be surprised at how often such letters open a door. If they do not, keep the data. How many times have you been willing to try? How often have you been rebuffed? These answers are maps. Finally, hold a larger, unsettling question as a lantern for the next hours and days. What institutions, rituals, and personal habits would I have to shed or invent to live more honestly between autonomy and connection? The question is not a moral accusation, but an invitation to inquiry. The life that navigates this tension skillfully is not the life that solves it once. It is the life that keeps coming back to the work, that builds small practices, that apologizes and mends and experiments. It is ordinary courage, practiced daily, with the humility to repair and the imagination to play. There is a terrible and beautiful admission that we rarely say out loud. Belonging often asks us to shrink, and freedom often asks us to risk what we have. Those two demands sit like a pair of lovers in any life, sometimes fierce, sometimes gentle, and each asks something of us that the other cannot supply. If you listen close enough, you can hear them whispering not as commands but as tests. Do you have the courage to be known and the discipline to be alone? Do you have the patience to stay and the moral imagination to leave? Consider rites of passage, the old human answer to an age-old problem. For millennia, cultures invented rituals precisely to negotiate transitions. Childhood to adulthood, the single life to marriage, the initiation of a craft, the ceremony of return after absence. These rituals did two things at once. They marked a departure and they marked a welcome. Leaving and returning were staged. Grief and joy had names and forms. In modern life, we have lost many of these ceremonies or made them optional. Marriage remains one, but even marriage is often treated as an endpoint rather than an evolving practice. The result is that transitions happen without maps. People change jobs, move cities, fall in and out of love without communal punctuation. And the consequence is a dispersed grief that looks like loneliness or resentment. One philosophical solution is simple: recreate, in small ways, rites of passage for ourselves and our groups. Invent a leaving night, a return lunch, a public testimony of what you learned on a sabbatical. The ritual does not have to be solemn. It only needs to be manifest. Naming an ending and a beginning is a moral technology that honors both freedom and belonging. There is also the quiet science of the brain that speaks to us here without moralizing. Social pain and physical pain share neural pathways. Rejection lights up parts of the brain that also register injury. This is not poetic metaphor, but a biological fact. We are wired to need others, and exclusion injures us. At the same time, solitude activates networks that allow for deep, associative thinking, the mind's background processes, the place where metaphors arise and where the future is imagined. The practical lesson is not to pretend we can opt out of either system. Instead, cultivate what psychologists call functional solitude. Solitude that is intentional, reflective, and bounded. Make time for it, structure it, and when it ends, bring the products of that solitude. A piece of writing, a plan, a new gesture of care, back into the world as an offering, not as proof or trophy. Hospitality is one of the most underrated practices for knitting freedom and belonging. True hospitality is not mere friendliness. It is an ethical architecture for welcoming difference without collapsing it. It asks questions like, who is safe here? How do we balance comfort and challenge? How do we expect people to show up? And what support do newcomers need to find their footing? Small acts of hospitality, an invitation to dinner that includes a simple explanation of table rhythms, a walking buddy for someone new to the neighborhood, are not trivial. They are the scaffolding of belonging. Hospitality transforms strangers into neighbors, and neighbors into the people who will notice you on a bad day. At the same time, hospitable communities insist on exit ways. Ways for people to leave without punishment and to return without being shamed. This is how communities become resilient rather than coercive. There is a moral economy in how we distribute recognition. Some people are habitually seen. Their labor, their pain, their gifts constantly mirrored back, while others fade into the background, their contributions taken for granted. This asymmetry becomes a social toxin. Correcting it is not grand virtue signaling. It is a mundane discipline that we can practice daily. Notice who in your circle rarely gets named. Practice naming them. In meetings, make it a rule to invite someone who is quiet to speak. In families, ask the person who does the hidden labor, the one who fixes the thermostat, the one who cleans the gutters, to tell how it feels to be the unnoticed keeper. These small habit changes reallocate recognition and, over time, rebalance belonging. There is also a deeper political truth. Societies that promise unfettered individualism without public goods end up hollow. Autonomy without shared infrastructure is a brittle autonomy. It is freedom for those who have means and a curse for those who do not. Conversely, communities that prioritize solidarity without spaces for dissent become oppressive. The philosophical task for a civic life is to design institutions that provide both: public goods that allow people to pursue projects of autonomy, public education, libraries, parks, healthcare, and legal procedural protections for dissent and difference. At a personal scale, this translates into the practice of civic smallness. Invest in local institutions, show up for neighborhood meetings, support public spaces, and treat the act of participation as an expression of belonging that secures your future freedom. Creativity, which we have returned to often, deserves another angle. The forms that sustain creative lives are small economies of freedom embedded in social frameworks. An atelier, a writing circle, a band, a lab, these are not only places where skills are sharpened, they are communities that hold the risk of failure. They provide a place to fail in public with witnesses who both critique and protect. To invent such a space where you are to start a reading group, to invite a few people to an experiment with rules for feedback, to coordinate a shared studio day, is to intentionally create an environment where belonging facilitates freedom. Put constraints on the practice. Time limits, explicit feedback rules, anonymity for first drafts. Constraints do not diminish freedom. They often produce it. Boundaries return again as a practical ethic. They are not merely defensive measures. Correctly understood, boundaries are invitations to mutual respect. Saying, "I can't do that tonight," is not only a refusal, it is also information that allows others to recalibrate. Boundaries become ethical when they are explained and negotiated. "I need this time alone because I'm working on an important project. I want to spend the weekend with you after next week. Can we plan for that?" The moral contour here is to treat boundaries as part of the grammar of a relationship rather than as a secret weapon. Model them, teach them to younger people, normalize them in communal life. In every practice we design, repair must be central. Belonging that cannot acknowledge harm is not belonging. It is submission. Freedom that refuses accountability is not freedom. It is license. Repair is the handshake between these two extremes. The protocols for repair, naming, taking responsibility, making amends, changing behavior, are the smallest units of a culture that values both autonomy and connection. Make repair ordinary. Teach children that mistakes demand response. Make workplace corrections immediate and restorative. When a civic wrong happens, hold a public process of repair that includes those harmed in designing a remedy. Finally, there is the gentle art of curiosity. Ask questions not as weapons, but as probes. How did that feel for you? What did you hope for when you did that? What would make this easier for you? Curiosity is not neutral. It is moral and courageous. It assumes the other has a world of feeling and reason that you do not yet know. Curiosity dissolves the fake binary that says you must either be completely free or completely known. When curiosity is steady, it becomes a culture of inquiry that sustains both solitude and solidarity. As you move through the rest of the series, carry a practice with you. Choose one public or private ritual to invent or reclaim this month. Make it small, measurable, and repeatable. Invite one other person to hold you accountable for keeping it for 4 weeks. At the end of those 4 weeks, reflect. Did the ritual change anything in your sense of belonging or your ability to act freely? If it did, refine and keep it. If it did not, ask why. Failure is data, not doom. We are making a kind of map together, and maps are always partial. The terrain between freedom and belonging is vast. It contains personal histories and public institutions, neurons and narratives, architecture and art. Each part of this map, rituals, recognition, repair, hospitality, boundaries, civic investment, is a route through the landscape. The work is not to pick one path forever, but to learn the features of all so you can choose wisely when weather changes. Late at night, when the house is settled and the glow from a screen is the only light, you can hear a different kind of neighborhood. The endless, humming network of other people's lives scrolling past like distant windows. A message pings, you open it and feel briefly seen. You post a photo. The heart icons accumulate, and for a minute your chest loosens. Then you put the phone down and notice a hollow where a conversation might have been. This particular architecture of modern life, what we call the digital, has become the arena in which the ancient dance between freedom and belonging finds new steps, new tempos, and new traps. The internet is, at once, an unprecedented amplifier of both autonomy and attachment. It allows a person in a small town to learn a craft from a teacher on another continent. It permits queer teens to find others like themselves in a place where physical community is unreachable. Yet the same infrastructure reduces recognition to metrics and trades the slow weight of trust for the brittle glitter of visibility. The problem is not the medium itself. Tools are morally neutral at first. but how those tools structure our attention, our expectations, and our rituals. Consider the phenomenon of the curated self. Whereas identity once emerged slowly through repeated actions and communal memory, online identity can be composed, edited, and posted in a single sitting. That composability is a kind of freedom. We can experiment, we can show facets, but it is also a pressure. When belonging is structured around performance metrics, we learn to optimize for applause. The more we optimize, the more we risk mistaking curated recognition for genuine recognition. Likes and shares can feel like witness, but are rarely the same thing as being held by someone who knows your contradictions and will stay when you are not performing. Then there are the one-sided relationships, parasocial bonds with creators, influencers, or public figures that feel intimate without reciprocity. They can be tender, they can be educational, they can also be deceptive. The person who consumes a stream of intimacy without giving or receiving real mutual recognition risks building their social life on scaffolding that will not support weight. Parasocial relationships can soothe loneliness, but they do not replace the careful, sometimes boring work of mutual witness and repair. The attention economy is a particular kind of predator in this landscape. Platforms are engineered to keep eyes and hearts engaged. Their incentives reward novelty, outrage, and immediacy. Our nervous systems are not built to pace this. We are designed for small group rhythms, face-to-face reciprocity, the slow accumulation of reputation. The constant interruption of notifications fragments focus, reduces tolerance for solitude, and trains rewards toward external validation. Creativity, which needs long, unbroken spans of attention and the safety to fail privately, is starved when attention is parceled into ever smaller fragments. Politics and conflict mutate here too. Social media can be a public square and a rumor mill, a place for mobilization and for cruelty. The algorithms tend to favor spectacle and moral certainty. Dialectical nuance is poor clickbait. The result is a tendency toward polarization where belonging becomes an us against them construct, and freedom becomes an amplifier for shouting rather than listening. Communities form quickly and fracture just as fast, often around single salient issues, with little scaffolding for repair or long-term commitment. None of this is to say the digital age is a moral catastrophe. It is a reconfiguration that requires new practices and new metaphors. Philosophically, we must resist the temptation to respond by romanticizing an imagined past of wholesome, unmediated community. The past had its own exclusions and violences. Instead, we should treat the digital as a new ecosystem with its own niches and predators that must be stewarded. This stewardship has three domains: how individuals manage attention and presence, how communities invent rituals and norms for online life, and how societies and platforms design infrastructures that support durable recognition rather than fleeting metrics. At the personal level, begin by treating attention as an ethical resource. Name a weekly attention budget. Carve out hours that are sacred for deep work, for solitude, for face-to-face time, and for slow online engagement. Use concrete constraints: 3 checking windows per day, 90-minute blocks of phone-free work, a 24-hour rule before publicly responding to a heated post. These constraints are not puritanical denials. They are instruments for generosity, for being fully present when you are with someone and for giving yourself the quiet you need to think. Practice micro-rituals. A 2-minute breath before you open social media, a short note to self about why you are posting before you hit publish, a nightly 5-minute gratitude log that is written, not uploaded. These small habits retrain attention away from reflexive consumption and toward intentional presence. Psychologically, cultivate what clinicians call digital sobriety with compassion, not shame. Notice the emotions that follow different digital behaviors. Does scrolling relieve anxiety or magnify comparison? Do you post to connect or to prove? Use curiosity to map patterns rather than moral panic to punish them. Practices from mindfulness, breath awareness, body scans, noticing urges without acting are useful here. They create a gap between stimulus and response where freedom reasserts itself. Combine them with relational practices. Tell a friend you'll do a phone-free dinner and ask them to hold you to it. External accountability is a social technology for private discipline. Community-level tools can be imaginative and surprisingly small. designated slow channels for real conversation within groups, enforced norms for meetings that include time for personal check-ins, regular digital co-presence sessions where people work in silence together and then share progress. These are simple scaffolds that recreate the third places we need. Online communities can adopt repair protocols. When harm occurs, pause the conversation, take a 24-hour cooling-off period, convene a small circle that includes those harmed to craft responses. Naming and normalizing these norms reduces the combustibility that algorithms feed upon. Platform-level solutions matter too. And while individuals cannot redesign the internet alone, collective political action can nudge platforms toward humane design. Imagine alternatives to applause-based metrics, systems that surface long-form comments, that promote slow threads over instant virality, that give users more control over what counts as engagement. Imagine platform defaults that encourage deliberation, prompts that ask, before you post, would you like to rate how likely this is to hurt someone? Small nudges can change incentives. Civic life must think of digital infrastructure as public architecture, and demand designs that privilege recognition, context, and repair. Creativity can be rescued by deliberate social architecture. Create or join micro-communities with strict rules. A writing circle that mandates failing drafts. An art collective that practices anonymous critique. A band that meets weekly for practice without any expectation of professionalization. These bounded communities allow people to risk and to be seen in a way that algorithms cannot replicate. They reestablish the apprenticeship model online, slow, iterative, and witness-rich. There is also the ethical question of commodified belonging. When companies sell belonging to us, identity-branded communities you can buy into with a subscription, they change the grammar of recognition into a marketplace. That can be useful, but it risks making belonging conditional on consumption. Philosophically, ask, what belongs in the market and what belongs in the commons? Intentional public investment in non-commercial spaces, libraries, community centers, public art remains crucial. Try this experiment this week as a concrete practice. Perform a social media audit. Track for 3 days the emotions you feel before and after your main online sessions. Then choose 2 actions. 1 pruning, unfollow or mute 3 accounts that trigger comparison or anger. And 1 planting, follow 2 accounts that teach, provoke well, or expand curiosity. Then create a slow post. Write something with the aim of curiosity, not applause. A paragraph about what you learned today and 1 question you don't have an answer to. Send it to a small list of people you trust rather than broadcasting it widely. Notice the difference. Finally, ask larger questions that are themselves practices of freedom. What kind of recognition do you seek? Is it mirroring of your image or witness to your becoming? How much of your belonging are you willing to trade for convenience and speed? What communal rituals would you be willing to invent that make digital life less like a marketplace and more like a village? These are not rhetorical traps but lanterns. The answers will be partial and provisional, but they will be the materials of a new choreography. The digital age has not removed the ancient fact. Humans need both autonomy and connection. It has only complicated how we find them. To live wisely now is to be an attentive steward of your inner life, a creative builder of small communities, and a citizen who demands public architectures that recognize us not as metrics but as persons. The work is practical, moral, and imaginative, a task for craftsmen, not prophets. The smell of wood shavings and hot metal is its own kind of memory. You can stand in an old workshop and hear the hum of 1,000 small economies at once. The soles of shoes hitting the floor, the bell that called apprentices to supper, the low murmur of instruction. In those rooms, the dance between freedom and belonging was taught not as a lecture but as a habit. If you want to understand how humans have learned to hold autonomy and connection together, look to the slow architectures people have built for transmitting skill, status, and mutual care. Apprenticeships, guilds, monastic orders, cooperatives, and the myriad rituals that frame departure and return. Apprenticeship is an elegant solution to a stubborn problem. The craftsperson who takes on an apprentice gives up something, the privacy of their practice, the monopoly of skill, and in return gains continuity and support. The apprentice gives up a degree of immediate freedom, the right to wander, to fail openly at scale, and in return gains access to a world of practice, to judgment that shapes and disciplines, and to recognition that eventually confers status. The structure matters. There is usually a named entry, a probationary time, graded responsibilities, a public test or demonstration, and a formal acceptance into the community. The ceremony, the turning in of a piece of work, the public examination, the applause of peers, is not theatrical fluff. It is the social proof that a person has been seen, judged, and welcomed. That witness is the very stuff of belonging. Guilds institutionalized these patterns. They regulated standards, managed apprenticeships, pooled resources for members in need, and enforced norms. Guild halls were places of feast and arbitration, of training and mutual insurance. In exchange for disciplinary constraints, rules about work, standards of quality, obligations to neighbors' members gained economic security, shared reputation, and a voice in communal life. The moral calculus was complex. Guilds protected craft from sloppy imitation and provided a safety net, but they could also exclude, entrench privilege, and ossify innovation when they became too rigid. Their lesson is clarifying rather than prescriptive. Structure can create both freedom and belonging, but the quality of that structure matters. Monastic communities solved a similar paradox inside a different grammar. The monk or nun who enters a cloister accepts severe constraints. Schedules of prayer, shared labor, vows that limit personal choice. And yet, within that strict architecture, many find an immense interior freedom. The paradox is instructive. Constraints, when chosen and ritualized, can create a space where the person is freed from petty anxieties and thus able to cultivate depth. Monasteries offered education, healthcare, and hospitality. They disciplined the self while embedding it in a larger, purposeful life. The psychological consequence was predictability and meaning. The philosophical one was a reminder that freedom often blooms in cultivated soil. Then there are the experiments of mutual aid and cooperative enterprise. Groups that pool resources, share governance, and redistribute risk. Cooperatives from village credit unions to worker-owned factories show that economic life can be structured to support both individual initiative and collective well-being. These arrangements preserve autonomy. Worker-owners often have meaningful say in decisions, while providing belonging through shared purpose and risk-bearing. The trade-offs are again instructive. Democratic governance slows decision-making and can lead to messy negotiation, but it also builds commitment in ways hierarchical profit-only models do not. These are not romanticized utopias. They are pragmatic experiments that show belonging can be a design choice, not merely a cultural accident. Cultures across the world have ritualized the transitions that matter: the potlatch and naming ceremonies, the rites of passage that mark coming of age and marriage, the initiation into clans and guilds. These rituals do two things. They make change visible, and they allow communities to grieve and celebrate simultaneously. The transparency of transition is the social technology that prevents leaving from becoming a theft and arrival from becoming an unearned claim. When we lack rituals, departures are treated as betrayals and arrivals as intrusions. When we have them, departures are honored and returns are welcomed. None of these forms are pure. Guilds could become gatekeepers. Monasteries could calcify into dogma. Cooperatives could be captured by charismatic leaders. What matters is the pattern. Human beings repeatedly invent scaffolds that trade temporary constraint for durable freedom, that bind obligations to protections. These historical forms teach practical lessons we can translate into contemporary life. First, make learning public. One of the hardest things for modern professions is that training is often private, atomized, and invisible. The guild model insists on public demonstration as part of becoming. Modern analogs exist: code reviews, thesis defenses, juried shows, but many fields could benefit from making apprenticeship explicit: mentorship contracts, staged evaluations, public exhibitions of work in progress. Visibility creates accountability and recognition at once. Second, structure graduated responsibility. The apprentice's pathway from observation to practice to mastery is a cadence we can reintroduce into careers and communities. Too many jobs expect instant competence or offer endless autonomy without the scaffolding to handle it. Design pathways where novices have supervision and masters have obligations to teach. This is not paternalism. It is the social technology for creating genuine autonomy. Third, Design rituals for transitions. Name them, mark them, and make them ordinary. A team that completes a major project can have a ritual of rest and testimony. A community that welcomes newcomers can hold a potluck with introductions that include a story of arrival. Rituals need not be elaborate. They need only be repeated and visible. Fourth, build mutual aid into institutions. A small communal fund for emergencies, a shared mentorship pool, rotational responsibilities. These reduce the brittleness of isolated autonomy. Practical, low-stakes mutual aid builds trust. It teaches that belonging is not an abstraction but a set of behaviors we can schedule and fund. Fifth, insist on apprenticeships for leadership. Leaders who emerge without being mentored often replicate patterns of domination or fear. Create formal mentorship for new leaders with accountability checks, and with staged autonomy that grows with demonstrated competence and reparative practices. Psychologically, these structures map onto how we form identity. When a learner is witnessed, corrected without shame, and allowed failure within a circle of support, their sense of agency grows. The public rights and graded responsibilities replace the twin pathologies of pretend competence and perpetual dependence. In communities, this becomes a culture that values both risk and repair. People are allowed to try and fail because repair protocols and mutual aid are expected. There is a practical experiment you can try that borrows directly from these old forms but fits the modern life you inhabit. Invent an apprenticeship for something that matters to you. It need not be long-term or legally binding. Do the work in 5 steps. Name the skill, find 1 or 2 people you trust as witnesses or mentors, set a timeline with progressively challenging tasks, create a public piece that demonstrates what you've learned, a masterpiece of sorts, and arrange a small ritual of acknowledgement. A simple evening where you read or display the work and the witnesses speak to what they saw. Offer and receive feedback according to agreed rules. Description before judgment, questions before advice. If you want to be bolder, add a small mutual aid clause. Everyone chips in a small amount to support one person's learning each year. That tiny economy creates reciprocity and signals that belonging is a practice, not a slogan. Ask yourself, what would a modern guild look like in your field? How would membership be earned and lost? What would the rituals of admission and exit be? Could your workplace or neighborhood afford a small mutual aid fund or a mentorship ladder? These design questions are as much aesthetic as they are pragmatic. They shape what it feels like to be free inside a community. History offers both consolation and challenge. People have always been creative in inventing ways to hold the tensions we feel, but they have also been blind to the exclusions their systems baked in. The careful student of these forms learns to borrow patterns and to correct their blind spots. Structure can be emancipatory when it is chosen, transparent, and reparable. It is oppressive when it is secret, coercive, and immutable. So when you think of belonging and freedom, picture again that old workshop. The apprentice listening as a tool is passed, the master watching as a hand learns to guide, the community gathering to test a piece of work. There is noise, friction, boredom, laughter, and sometimes anger. There is also the slow formation of competence and a witness that will carry a person forward. That is the craft of communal life. Designing practices that let people learn, fail, be seen, and then step into the solitary spaces of invention with the quiet assurance that a table will be set for their return. There is a place inside the body where biography and biology meet, not in a tidy ledger but in a weather system. The quickening of the chest when a voice calls your name, the sudden stillness when a hand withdraws, the dull, persistent ache that follows a dismissal you half expected and half denied. If the earlier parts of this narration have been about stories and structures, here we stand at the border where story becomes somatic. The nervous system keeps score. It does not argue with your philosophy. It remembers how the world treated you and adjusts its expectations accordingly. To live well between freedom and belonging, then we must learn both the language of the mind and the grammar of the body. At first glance, this seems technical, autonomic, this vagal, but the practical truth is simpler and more urgent. Our bodies are the primary instruments of recognition and threat. When someone meets your gaze in a way that steadies you, your chest loosens. When someone dismisses you, your gut tightens. This is not metaphor. Embodied states shape what we can imagine, the languages we can use, the risks we will take. A person whose body habitually lives in mobilized alarm, ready to flee or fight, will find belonging hard because proximity becomes a danger signal. A person who tends to withdraw, whose body says, "I'm safe by staying small," will find autonomous assertion terrifying because it risks exposure. Both patterns are adaptive answers to past conditions. Neither is a moral failure. They are clues. There are psychological models that translate this physiology into practice, ways of understanding how attachment and threat interact inside the skin. One useful frame is to notice the three common regulatory states many people move through: activation, alarmed, agitated, dissociation, shut down, numb, and regulated engagement, curiosity, warmth, openness. These are not static labels but shifting climates. Our task is not to eliminate activation or dissociation. Both have roles, but to increase our capacity to return to regulated engagement and to invite others to meet us there. The language of co-regulation matters. Human systems stabilize not only by one person calming themselves, but by another person offering a rhythm or a steadying presence. This is the physiology of being held. What does co-regulation look like in the small, concrete moments of life? It looks like two people slowing their breathing together when talk heats up, like a pair of friends walking at the same pace until the awkwardness dissolves into conversation, like a parent lowering their voice and making space when a child's grief erupts. It looks like the practiced move of naming a state. I notice my chest is tight. I'm going to take 3 breaths and then I'll try to explain. Names return experience from chaos to pattern. They allow the nervous system to categorize and therefore metabolize what it feels. This is a modest miracle. Language can shape physiology. There are simple techniques that reliably move bodies from alarm to engagement. Breath is primary, slow, extended exhales signal safety to the autonomic system. Grounding, feeling the feet on the floor, naming sensory details in the room, brings attention out of spiraling story and back into the instrument you inhabit. Rhythmic movement, walking, drumming, shared work, entrains 2 or more bodies into a common tempo that invites cooperation. Ritualized touch, when consensual and safe, a hand on a shoulder, holding hands while crossing a street, provides direct vagal input that calms. None of these are magic bullets. They are practices that increase the bandwidth for conversation, for risk-taking, for repair. Psychology offers intervention models that are helpful guides here. Therapies that emphasize attachment and emotion, for instance, those that teach emotional awareness, affect labeling and reflective listening, do not privatize feeling. They train people to offer their inner states as objects of attention and therefore as negotiable items. Imagine 2 partners practicing a safe haven script in negotiation. One says, "When I feel overwhelmed, I will signal with the phrase, 'I need a pause.' That pause does not mean I am leaving you. It means I'm protecting our conversation. After 15 minutes, I will return and we will try again." A simple agreed-upon script like that introduces a predictable path out of escalation. It takes away the mystery of withdrawal and replaces it with a covenant of return. Another practical principle is effect first, content second. When emotion runs high, attempts to solve the problem analytically often fail. The body speaks in tone long before the mind has finished its sentence. Start within the felt sense. I'm noticing I feel frightened. My chest feels tight and I'm not sure why. I'm tired and snappish. These statements invite co-regulation. They do not demand immediate solutions. They are micro-skillful acts of humility that turn conflict into an experiment. What happens when we map the physiology before prescribing a remedy? Repair protocols must include the body. Apologies that are only verbal and abstract often fail to land if the physiological trace of the harm remains active. Small embodied reparative acts, sitting in the kitchen together and breathing for 3 minutes, a handwritten note left on the pillow, a shared silence in which no one interrupts, do the biochemical work of trust building. Repair needs time. The nervous system is conservative and slow to reassign safety. Repair, then, is both moral and metabolic. It is the practice of changing another person's expectation that proximity will be painful, and it requires consistency. There are daily practices that cultivate a body that can both be alone and be close. Start with microregulation. 5 minutes of morning breath work, a midday walk without headphones, a short evening body scan where you name sensations without judgment. These are not self-help pieties. They are training regimens for the nervous system. Over weeks, they increase tolerance for ambiguity, allow curiosity to return, and make it likelier that when you stand at the edge of a difficult conversation, you will have the internal resources to stay rather than flee. Pair these with relational experiments. Schedule a 30-minute presence date with someone, no phones, no agenda, where the goal is simply to notice each other. The practice of mutual presence is muscle work. There are also philosophical practices that complement the physiological work. Stoicism's reminder to distinguish what is in your control and what is not can be embodied. You cannot control whether someone recognizes you, but you can control how you regulate your body and communicate your internal state. Existentialism's insistence on responsibility for choice can be tempered by recognition that choices are always situated in a body with a history. The wise stance here is not purity of theory but fidelity to practice. Adopt frameworks that invite action and then test them in the laboratory of your life. Narrative work belongs here too. Our bodily patterns are entangled with the stories we tell about ourselves. The anxious person thinks themselves needy. The avoidant person calls themselves independent as a flag against shame. Narrative therapy suggests that if you reauthor the story, I am someone who needs time to feel safe, and that is a reasonable, reparable need. The body will slowly follow the mind into new habits. Reauthoring is not a solo trick. It often requires witnesses who can hold the new story until it becomes plausible. This is why mentorship, friends, and therapeutic relationships are not luxuries, but scaffolds for bodily change. We must also be candid about limits. Some bodies carry deep scars from trauma that will not be shifted by a weekend of breathwork or a tidy experiment. In those cases, professional help, careful pacing, and safety planning are necessary. Saying this is not defeatist. It is realism. Courage is not heroic ignorance, but steady, patient care. For those whose pasts are violent or neglectful, the work of learning to belong and to take freedom is painstaking and slow, and societal support. Access to therapy, social safety nets, communities prepared to hold long processes is not optional. It is moral infrastructure. There are political implications embedded in this bodily story. Societies that reduce people to hyperactive, sleep-deprived, stress survivors will find relational life frayed. Policies that protect workers' time, guarantee healthcare, and fund community spaces are not merely economic engineering. They are public practices of co-regulation at scale. Imagine a city where parents had places to bring tired children and to rest themselves, where libraries offered quiet rooms for regulated solitude, where public design included spaces for calm. These policies expand the bodily bandwidth citizens have for engaging in committed, creative, and reparative relationships. What public design in your town or workplace would make it easier for people's bodies to feel safe enough to belong? These questions are not tests but experiments in curiosity. The body is not a prison or a mere vehicle. It is the theater in which the drama of freedom and belonging is performed. If we attend to its cues, learn its language, and build practices and institutions that respect its needs, we expand the room where both autonomy and connection can breathe. The work is tender and patient. It asks for small daily gestures, for rituals of pause and return, for public imagination that treats regulation as a commons. There is no final triumph here, only slow, incremental reweaving. A patch added, a knot tied, a rhythm learned. Yet those small repairs accumulate. They shape the kind of people we become and the kind of world we can build together. Walk with me for a while into the halls where nations, schools, companies, and neighborhoods do their work. Not the headlines, but the ordinary rooms where policy is made, meetings are convened, lessons are learned, and meals are shared. Institutions are the great amplifiers of human habit. They can harden a propensity towards solitude into systemic isolation, or they can cultivate the tender capacities that let autonomy and belonging flourish together. If the dance between freedom and belonging is a private craft, then institutions are the dance floor. Their shape, texture, and slippery spots determine whether we stumble or glide. Think first of schools. Children enter classrooms with bodies and stories already tuned by families and neighborhoods. The school either attunes those strings or rewrites them. What would it mean for schooling to treat recognition as basic literacy? Imagine classrooms where listening is practiced with the same seriousness as reading, where children learn to name feelings and to describe rather than judge. Imagine project work structured like apprenticeships. Students take on real problems, show their work publicly, receive coached critique, and graduate not merely with facts but with the habit of trying, failing, repairing, and returning. Such a practice would not flatten curiosity. It would scaffold it. It would teach children that freedom is exercised in competence, and belonging is won through visible contribution and acknowledged effort. The small changes are concrete. A routine for 2-minute witnessing at the start of class, a public portfolio review of projects, a rotation of childcare chores shared between older and younger students, a visible ritual to mark transitions between grades. Over time, these practices teach something that test scores cannot measure: how to risk in public and how to be mended in public. Now imagine workplaces. Most offices are constructed on a myth that autonomy means unfettered choice and productivity is the only currency of belonging. But people long for something deeper, for predictability and schedules so they can plan a life, for rights that mark when work is done and rest begins, for forums where mistakes are treated as data rather than grounds for exile. A different design is possible. Picture teams that adopt an apprenticeship cadence. Junior members paired with mentors, public showcases of failures as learning, and sabbaticals that are guaranteed rather than lottery prizes. Picture meetings that open with a 2-minute check-in and close with an agreed repair step when friction arises. Picture leave policies that treat family, grief, and self-formation as essential to civic health rather than optional benefits. These are not kindnesses solo. They are investments in the capacity of organizations to hold dissent and to make space for innovation. When a person can take a leave to write, to grieve, to train, and know their role awaits them on return, autonomy becomes a resource rather than a threat to belonging. Public spaces are the third hinge. Cities that build benches that face each other, libraries designed for both quiet study and small group collaboration, playgrounds that invite intergenerational work. These are not aesthetic choices only. They are civic technologies for human connection. The design of a street matters to the moral life. When neighborhoods have third places, cafes, community gardens, maker spaces, people have the scaffolding to experiment with belonging, to try being neighborly in small acts before committing to deeper ties. Public investment in arts, shared studios, and communal projects signals that belonging is a public good, not a luxury for those who can afford it. Institutions must also practice repair at scale. The mechanics of restorative practices, listening circles, facilitated apologies, reparation agreements, can be translated from families into courts, schools, and workplaces. A school that uses restorative circles after a serious conflict teaches students not only to be accountable, but to expect repair. A company that offers facilitated restitution when harm occurs keeps talent and trust where punitive expulsion would drive both away. Repair protocols make belonging credible because they show that being part of a group does not guarantee immunity from consequence, but does guarantee a path back if one is willing to do the work. There is a political dimension here that goes deeper than policies and design. Democracies are fragile where people feel irreparably excluded. Citizenship that reduces belonging to ballots every few years misses the day-to-day practices that produce civic identity. Cooperative childcare, neighborhood councils, shared festivals, small public rituals that say, "You are one of us." Political imagination must therefore include the humble infrastructure of belonging. Public libraries that are hubs of civic learning, town halls that convene not only during crises, but for ordinary communal experiments, participatory budgets that let neighbors decide shared priorities. Freedom without these shared infrastructures becomes a private privilege. Belonging without the capacity to dissent becomes an oppressive sameness. Technology and the market will not build this floor for us unless we choose it. Private platforms will create communities that can be bought or sold. Markets will conceive belonging as a subscription. That is useful but insufficient. Citizens must insist on a commons, digitally and physically, a set of places and protocols that resist foreclosure by profit. Imagine civic apps governed by neighborhood cooperatives that record local agreements, schedule shared rituals, and host repair circles. Imagine municipal investments in community sabbaticals or local apprenticeships funded as public goods. These are radical only in the sense that they reassert what was once ordinary, that social life is partly a public responsibility. Institutions must also cultivate psychological habits, training leaders in co-regulation, teaching managers restorative questioning, integrating time for reflection into work weeks. These are practices with measurable returns. Leaders who listen first, who model vulnerability, who normalize repair, set a tone that ripples outward. Small rituals, a weekly hour for shared failure stories, a public acknowledgement of someone else's unseen work, a team rule to pause and breathe when conversation heats, change atmospheres. Institutions that embed these practices become places where autonomy is practiced within scaffolds of care. But institutions can also calcify. They can become rituals without spirit, forms without repair. A company that institutes a restorative circle as a PR move will not create trust. A school that mandates listening without modeling will create cynics. The remedy is constant practice and accountability. Institutions must measure not only outputs but relational health, metrics that capture returnability, rates of repair, patterns of mentorship, and the vitality of third places. These metrics are not purely quantitative. They require qualitative work, stories, testimonies, and narrative audits that keep institutions honest. What can an ordinary person do in the face of such levers? More than you might think. Start by modeling the practices you want to see. In your workplace, propose a public failure hour where teams present one thing that went wrong and what they learned. In your neighborhood, convene a potluck with a naming ritual for newcomers and a small mutual aid fund. In schools, lobby for portfolios and public demonstrations of student work rather than strictly standardized tests. Small experiments attract imitators. Practices that foster both autonomy and belonging spread because they make life easier, not harder. And then ask the large questions out loud. What public rituals do we need to mark the transitions in our lives? What parts of our civic infrastructure would we be willing to fund collectively to ensure people can take sabbaticals, mourn properly, learn crafts, and return? How might we reimagine parole, juvenile justice, and community health as spaces of repair rather than permanent exclusion? These questions are political and philosophical at once. They insist that freedom and belonging are not merely private goods but civic achievements. If institutions are the dance floor, then our obligation is twofold: to shape the floor and to learn the steps. It is not enough to criticize institutions for failing us. We must also design alternatives, pilot them in our communities, and hold our leaders accountable with specific demands for leave policies, for third places, for mentorship ladders, for restorative practices. And when we succeed in one small place, we must tell the story widely so others can try, adapt, and improve. So here is a modest civic experiment you can carry into the coming month. Identify one institution you touch, your workplace, your school, your faith community, and propose a single practice that scaffolds both freedom and belonging. Make it small and testable. A 2-minute witnessing at meetings, a mentorship pair program, a quarterly restorative circle, a tiny mutual aid kitty. Run it for 3 months, document what changes, and invite critique. If it works, invite another group to adopt it. Propagate by replication rather than decree. Institutions are not amphitheaters where actors perform a script written by others. They are rooms we inhabit together and remake. The question is not whether institutions can be trusted. They are instruments that reflect our values, but whether we are willing to take up the craft of redesign. We have tools: rituals, apprenticeships, repair protocols, public spaces, and the moral imagination to reweave civic life. What we need is practice, patience, and persistence. There is a music that carries through all the parts you have just read, an undercurrent that is not a doctrine but a mood, the conviction that human life is safest when it is neither surrendered to an atomized self nor swallowed whole by a crowd. The rhythm returns again and again. Step toward, step away. Speak, then listen. Risk, repair, return. If the prior parts have been a map of the terrain, histories, brains, workshops, digital neighborhoods, institutions, and bodies, then this last movement is the choreography. It is less about final answers than about how to move with care inside the tension that will never disappear. That acknowledgement is itself a kind of relief. We do not need a single solution. We need steadiness, craft, and fidelity. Begin, if you will, with an image, two dancers on a small stage. Sometimes one leads, sometimes the other. Sometimes they circle without touching. Sometimes they lean into one another so closely they can hear the breath of the other. Their skill is not in erasing difference, but in finding signals. A glance, a touch, a pause that allow them to resynchronize when the music shifts. The choreography I offer is like that. A set of practices and stances that help you to resynchronize with yourself and with others when life pulls you toward extremes. First, cultivate steady attention as a moral practice. Attention is the currency in which recognition is paid. Wake up to small rituals that stabilize your interior. A brief breath practice, a 5-minute writing of a question you will carry through the day, a naming of one thing you are willing to risk. These are tiny but not trivial. They are the scaffolding for the other work. They make it more likely that when someone asks for recognition you can offer it genuinely, and more likely that when solitude calls you can answer without flinching from commitment. Second, place language where it matters. Speak with precision about needs and offers. I need 2 hours this afternoon to work. Can we plan dinner for 8? Is different from a curt, I can't. Naming the need, the boundary, and the proposal for repair or return converts mystery into method. Practice saying the small sentences that make relationships tractable. Teach this grammar in your families, your teams, your communities. It is a public resource. Third, ritualize departure and return. When you change, take a job, leave a role, come back from travel, mark it. Make small ceremonies that acknowledge loss and welcome new possibility. These do not have to be grand. A shared dinner, a written note, a public acknowledgement in a meeting. Rituals are not superstition. They are social technology that help bodies register the truth of change and ease the nervous system's passage. Fourth, design constraints that produce freedom. Voluntary limits, apprenticeship structures, sabbaticals, time solitude, curated feedback rules. Create the conditions for deep work and for safe risk in public. Choose constraints that are negotiable and transparent, and recruit witnesses who will hold you to them. Constraints, when embraced, are not prisons but enabling devices. Fifth, practice repair as a first response. Train yourself to notice when you have caused harm, to name it, to accept responsibility, and to propose a concrete remedy that can be tried and revised. Repair is not a one-off magic. It is a discipline that requires humility and repetition. Make it ordinary in the places you help shape. Families that rehearse apologies, offices that use restorative circles, friendships that have explicit covenants for handling harm. Sixth, steward institutions and public spaces as moral infrastructure. Vote, show up, design, and demand public goods that expand people's real choices. Support libraries, parks, apprenticeships, community kitchens, and cooperative enterprises. Remember that freedom without shared infrastructure is a brittle gift available to few. Belonging without mechanisms for descent and exit is coercion in disguise. Civic care is not optional. It is the background music that makes private dances possible. Seventh, reframe markets and technology rather than surrendering to them. Use the tools to enhance connection where you can. Create slow rituals for online life. Design micro-communities with strict norms when you gather digitally. Resist the commodification of belonging by insisting on shared, non-commercial spaces. Small civic experiments, neighborhood apps governed by cooperatives, artisanal guilds reviving mentorship, can reweave what markets have atomized. Eighth, attend to the body as the primary site of intelligence. Learn to name sensations, to breathe together, to entrain rhythms. When conflict erupts, delay content until co-regulation has returned. Make somatic practices ordinary. Short breath synchrony before meetings, shared walks as dialogue, brief grounding rituals after heated encounters. The body remembers. Treat it kindly and design your life to return it to curiosity. Ninth, remake your stories. Identify the narratives that govern your choices, the responsible child, the eternal loner, the brave quitter, and ask which ones serve your present integrity. Rewrite with witnesses. Tell new stories publicly, and watch as others begin to receive the new version of you. Narrative is not mere vanity. It shapes the trajectory of action and the responses of others. 10th, practice the apprentice's humility. Seek mentors, welcome novices, and make work visible. Create public demonstrations of learning and failure. The apprentice model is the social engine of both competence and belonging. It gives novices time and masters obligations. Where possible, institutionalize it. Mentorship pairings at work, community apprenticeships, family rituals that pass skill and story across generations. Through these moves, the private and the public begin to realign. But above practices and policies, there remains a moral orientation, an ethic of curious generosity tempered by integrity. Curious generosity asks you to assume that other people are as complicated and needy as you are. It invites you to listen without turning the other into a problem to solve. Integrity asks you to be honest about the costs of belonging and the truth of your needs. Together they form a stance that makes negotiation possible. Not easy, but possible. And because the dance is never finished, cultivate a habit of iteration. Try small experiments, hold them briefly, collect data. How did your body feel? Did trust increase? Did novelty survive? Revise. The life that holds freedom and belonging well is not static. It is adaptive. It learns through trial and keeps the humility to change course. There are questions I leave you with because questions are the tools of living inquiry. Which ties in your life are loving and chosen, and which are inherited scripts you can edit? What rituals would you design to mark the next transition you face? Who could be your apprentice or your mentor in a practice that matters to you? Which institution in your life most needs a repair protocol? And what would a small trial of repair look like there? What micro-constraints might free you to do your best work while keeping you connected to others? Ask these not as moral indictments, but as invitations to curiosity. Finally, hold a softer image. A table set for two, the light low, the music low enough that voices must lean toward one another. You do not need to be the perfect dancer. You need only to come to the floor again and again, to practice the steps, to apologize when you tread on toes, to listen when the other falters, and to keep some small promise that you will return. The dance between freedom and belonging is not a test to pass, but a life to be lived. Messy, stubborn, radiant. It asks us for courage and tenderness in equal measure. If you accept the invitation, you will not arrive at a final harmony. You will learn to make peace with the music and, in doing so, make a little more room for others to find themselves on the floor beside you.